Hello and welcome to another GeoTech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, inaugural director at the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center. To all of you that are joining us, whether you're joining us through YouTube, through the Zoom live audience that we have, or through the streaming platform of your choice, we're really glad you could join us today because we're going to have a robust conversation on the future of data, human rights, speech, and privacy. That's a lot to put into different packages. It also raises interesting questions about why now? What makes 2021 the moment in which we should be talking about it versus years past? What's different? And I'm really excited because the panelists we have today are going to be able to actually illuminate as to why this matters, what we can do about it, and how we can move forward. For our first guest, would like to invite a longtime friend of the GeoTech Center, even before then doing great work with Singularity University. Natana, welcome to the GeoTech Hour, and I'd be interested in your thoughts as to why are these issues now about the future of data, human rights, speech, and privacy coming to the forefront now? What's different now versus years past?
Well, first of all, such a pleasure to be here. So thank you, David. And I think, our Singularity University connection is a really good window into the answer to that question, because I think there's a number of different factors. One is that the kinds of technologies that were science fiction 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 5 years ago are now science reality, society reality. And so that means that we don't have the luxury of thinking about these questions as hypotheticals any longer. They are very real. The questions of how corporations and governments are using our data and what we're going to do about that is something that will either be decided for us or now we have to make some decisions. So I think that's a really powerful component. And then the other is the rise of the internet means that it's a lot easier to know what's happening around the world. So for all the human rights abuses that are going on in the world, similar, arguably worse, have been going on for all of human history and human civilization. The difference is that now we can know about it and people can organize and communicate with each other, and we can understand that this is happening in real time. So we have Planet taking satellite images of the entire Earth every day, and that can show where labor camps might be in the world. That doesn't mean that there weren't labor camps before, but we also didn't have images of the whole world every day available to us. So we now have access to a tremendous new degree of information. And that means that we are aware in real time of challenges that we weren't before.
I really like how you sort of arced that both of those. And if I could ask you as a quick follow-on, Natana, I mean, like you said, I mean, things that were only imagined or in science fiction 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago are now reality. And now too, we now know more about what's going on the planet and what humans are doing. Of course, there's always the challenge, of course, of discerning what really is happening versus what people are claiming was happening. But that's something we'll figure out as society. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, how do we even begin to have this conversation with policymakers and folks that deal with geopolitics that are not tech experts, but obviously need to understand these topics? So what would be your recommendation as to how can we even begin to bring people into this fold that may not be tech experts, but they want to be able to be informed by what's happening with these trends?
So shout out to everyone. I promise that David didn't ask me to say this, but I really think that communication is the key. And so, for example, I really encourage policymakers and their staff to read the Geotech Center's report, which is a collaboration of experts and also folks who are really trying to make the nature of these complex technical problems easy to understand if you're not technical, particularly around what are the implications and what can we actually do about this. And so, I think that there's no substitute to communication and education. Right now, if you're a policymaker, depending on where you're making policy, you need to make decisions about a wide array of very complex topics. So finding independent um, organizations to get information from is really important.
Well, I think if I could virtually bless, you succeeded in making me virtually bless. I appreciate that shout. I was not expecting that at all. We'll definitely circle back, and I'll have to. I'll circle back later because I'll also ask what are you seeing on the West Coast, and how do we bridge not just the coast but the heartland. But I'll circle back after we've had a chance to hear from Alex and Chris. So Alex, you've been clearly a change agent as well as with Natana and making things happen in the space. What is your take on why are we talking about these issues now? Why is the future of data, human rights, speech, and privacy at the forefront now?
Yeah, and also thanks for inviting me to participate in this. I guess I think I have maybe two related social points. I think to the two technological points that Natana was making, and I'm not sure why certain things hit a threshold and then at certain moments they become more widespread or more normalized. But I think part of realizing things that have been underway for a while, I think one of them is that the implicit assumptions around human agency have reached a point where people have different beliefs about them. And so, for example, to me, like just as an observer of the discussion over the past couple of years, like in public and on Twitter and in congressional hearings of our beliefs around how manipulable human beings are by other humans or by technology, about how our consciousness works. Um, the idea that we are very manipulable and have to do things in order to um, sort of like steward our information environment because it will almost certainly wind up affecting us and structuring our agency. I don't know that it's been explicitly said that this has shifted in the last few years, but to me it clearly has. And I think it's sort of like, your luggage when you fly, that it sort of shifts mid-flight and you're not sure when, but when you open when you open the overhead compartment, it falls out on you.
Hmm.
To me, part of what I get from, again, just as a listener and observer, is that things have shifted about how we think about human agency, and so it's useful now to be more explicit about that and figure out what that means for us, because I think um, that relationship is much more explicit now, or maybe it's hit a threshold, like I said, where it seems palpable, or at least to some people undeniable. And I think the second one that's sort of related to Natana's point about the internet is that I think the sort of material conditions of technology are asking us to re-examine some of our principles and assumptions, and slogans around sort of law and policy and philosophy. So just one example there is like, I think people have often quoted Justice Brandeis saying the cure for bad speech is more speech.
Right.
Um, if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, I don't know that you think that anymore, or
I
do,
was gonna
or
say.
if the unit economics of internet speech have gone down to the point where incremental, expensive, more speech that can drown out other speech or contextualize it in a confusing way has changed, then some of these slogans, I don't think we should abandon them, but I think they have to be, they came out of a particular time, including like the cost of publication and the ephemerality of the human voice and other like laws of the natural world that have been partially repealed and modified by technology. And
Hmm.
so we have to go back to some of our like bedrock slogans and examine whether they still apply under the technological and material conditions we work in, which is sort of difficult because like they're so entrenched, I think, in our consciousness of first principles. But and I don't suggest that we jettison them, but it's possible that in some circumstances the cure for bad speech is not more speech, and then we need to figure out what our more descriptive other slogans are going to be. And I feel like that also feels very palpable to me now.
I am smiling because one, that was very insightful what you shared, Alex, and I really liked your analogy of like how you don't realize that your luggage just shifted on the plane during the flight until you open it up and it falls on your head, and that may be what we're experiencing right now is our luggage has shifted. But then too, I had a personal experience back in 2017 when I was dealing with what at the time I tried to point out was a flood of comments, some of which were of questionable human origin, and people at the time didn't believe me because I guess in 2017 they weren't really there. And just recently, we know the New York Attorney General said, yeah, 18 million of the 22 million were of questionable human origin, which is more than 85%. And that just points to, like you said, that analogy of the cure for bad speech is more speech. Not if you have a lot of bots, because they can just flood you.
Yeah,
Peterson, your
totally.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we use and it's funny because in content moderation land, I think one of the questions we would struggle with was, you have bots that are directed by humans, either like working algorithmic, like programmatically, or working within certain parameters, and so they are indirectly human speech. But then also we would have to work through a lot of the sort of conceptual questions of content moderation, like does a bot deserve notice? Like does a bot have a right to an appeal?
Yep.
Or if you're a bot master, like are you entitled to notice because you're using an instrumentality that like suggests that you're doing something harmful? And so I think it leads us both to like fun singularity direction of being like, do bots have rights, and like, do they need their own bill of rights, and like, what code would we write it in, and then also these other sort of like revisiting of other questions. The other thing I wanted to mention, as it relates to things like newer technologies that Natana was mentioning, when I think about my experience with brain-machine interface, one of the things that I've come to believe is that it's it's not the novelty strikes people to consider things that have been happening for a while. So I
Hmm.
think like in this case, like the directness of the notion that we will potentially, we'll have data that is comes from your brain activity in a much less mediated way, not unmediated, but much more directly. And that something about the qualitative aspect of putting electrodes in the brain and thinking about recording from that gets people to think about privacy and the events that are literally happening inside your head being recorded in a way that is really just as true for things that happen on your phone or things that happen on a camera trained on your face, or
Right.
things with you. And so to me, a lot of the privacy implications of some of the newer technologies is that they, for whatever reason, because they have a starkness or they have like a novelty to them that cause people to have an aha moment that actually just sort of like throws into greater relief the things that have been happening for a while, which is that the amount of data on your phone and again on public cameras and other places can be aggregated in ways that can be used to manipulate you or sort of reduce your agency. But there's something about some of the newer technologies that make people realize like, oh wow, this is really real. But in some ways, like phone is, your thumbs are just like a very inefficient connection to your brain, and
Right.
so we're going to get higher bandwidth ones eventually. But the some of the ground issues are not necessarily that different, and so it's nice to be like, whatever wakes people up to the gravity of it, I think is useful and timely.
I think that's very well said, and I like you said, it's just about these things have been happening, and we've already been putting things in phones, we've already been putting things in the public space with cameras, and now it's coming to the forefront in ways that now, as we think about brain-computer interface, now it's coming to the forefront. I often think that right now the debates we're seeing on AI and about, well, will AI be biased? It's really a proxy for the conversation that our own societies are biased, and so AI is just a reflection of our biases, and so really like that idea, Alex, that it's sometimes tech becomes the scapegoat or the proxy for what are the bigger issues that we haven't been talking about for a while. So with that, that's a good segue to Chris. So you've already had Natana and Alex sort of already set the bar high. Chris, welcome to the GeoTech Hour. Really glad you could hear. And I'll ask you the same question. Why are these issues at the forefront now versus in the past? What's different?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I want to build on what both Nathania and Alex said, and but both from a historical and a mathematical perspective. So let's rewind quite a bit into human history. Go back to before writing was widespread, when the reading rates literacy rates were quite low. How did you get information? Well, by talking to people. And if let's say that you were the ruler of a nation state, how do you understand the economics? How does your general decide how a battle is going? It's a small world network. And so that's the 6 degrees of separation. I can ask so-and-so who asks so-and-so who asks so-and-so, and I try to get these different paths of information back to me. Then as writing became a little bit more widespread, papyrus was expensive, learning to read and write was very expensive. The Chinese invented the movable type, but the economics weren't quite there yet. But then when you combine that with the power transduction revolution of pre-Renaissance Europe, where they could convert linear motion repeated into circular motion, now you can make fabric efficiently, you can have paper efficiently, and there's this movement of taking this thing that was kind of a toy and making it into production. So now you move into you start getting to what we call scale-free networks. So small world, again, is where there's a lot of connections. Think about a lattice, but with a lot of other connections. A scale-free network is where you have highways of information dissemination. So you might have had a religious organization that printed these things. They teach their priests of how to read, and then they pass the books down through those, and that was the highway. But then with the printing press, there was more publishers. The economics of publishing were changing. But then something interesting happened in the last 100 years of moving from telegraphs to the internet, where it's not just scale-free networks anymore, where there's the publishers who control things. So there's some gatekeeping, there's some control, but for better and worse, right? So somebody who's in power can control the narrative. But now there's the scale-free and the small networks that are both dominating. And I think this is parallel to what we see in logistics. Originally you move things from one place to another via person or horse or whatever you happen to have. and then sea travel unlocked a lot. And now we have platforms like Uber and Lyft, or Grubhub, things that can move things locally, and the scale-free network, and they're competing. And all of this together from a mathematical perspective makes nonlinear dynamics really hard to predict, and turns everything into the derivative. So it's about the rate of change rather than your scale. And in network theory, we see that the utility of your network is quadratic with the scale of your network. So
Wow.
the bigger your network, the faster you go, the stronger you are. And now we're in an age where we literally have the tools of weapons of mass destruction of information, which we didn't have before. We've sort of moved through that and into this space. So I think that all of the issues that we're talking about today, human rights, privacy, free speech, dissemination of information together, they're all one issue. They're different flavors, different faces of the same thing, with this underpinning of nonlinear dynamics, which are hard to predict, and we need to figure out how to govern and understand these systems better.
Wow, that was a wonderful way to sort of set the stage that really what we're facing, like you said, it's been the arc of history where now we've got, it's almost a competition between do you operate as a monolithic, almost nation state or a conglomerate, or do you operate as a more decentralized network? And the answer is probably both, but then it's just figuring out how it works out. So I guess first, a personal story, then I'll ask you a question. We were talking a little bit earlier about where I had the fun with bots back in 2017, and it was fascinating because Alex talked about, do we give bots, do bots have a right to notice? Do they have a voice? The other thing was just that at the time the lawyers had said you need to allow bots to submit on third parties, that if you block the bots, you're blocking third parties. So this just points to how does law catch up with these nonlinear dynamics. And so I would be interested in your thoughts, Chris. Given what we've seen already with Congress's engagements on tech and how that has gone and fared, what would be your recommendation for how do we begin to have a conversation with, whether it's the US Congress, whether it's members of the European Union, how do we help them understand that we're in an age in which networks and nation states are either possible to compete or possible to collaborate in this new world?
Yeah, I would say the same message that I talk about with regard to machine learning, and that is robustness and trying to characterize the second and third order effects. It's very easy to legislate yourself into a corner where you say, we need to outlaw this because this is really bad. But if you do, then all of the things creep around and start to make it even worse than you'd imagined before. Or now your nation state is behind because you limited something that was good. And so I think that it's, what is the smallest, Occam's razor? What is the smallest law that does what we want, but that has the fewest artifacts around the edges? But also, let's think through, in war game, how our adversary is going to react to this law. How are bad people, or people who are just trying to make a buck or trying to make a living, who are trying to skirt this? What will that look like? And come up with robust legal solutions. And I think it involves not just lawyers, but people, people who understand the law, what it does, historians, mathematicians. I think it's a dialogue among all these different facets, technologists, to figure out what could happen and how do we guide and steer as opposed to control it.
I love that. I mean, what I'm hearing is, and I love your idea, is an office of policy red teaming, which is before anything becomes law or policy, we at least get a diverse group of people to say, how might this have unintended side effects? I mean, I remember it was, it was recent where it was about 6 or 9 months ago when they were talking about having exports controls on AI. And I was just scratching my head because I'm like, okay, replace the word AI with just really fancy mathematics. Would we be talking about, we shall not export really fancy mathematics? That just doesn't seem to resonate. So I like the idea of that. And I'm going to real quick segue to Natana before I jump back to Alex, because I know, Natana, you've been talking about how it's about the role of innovators. And we heard from both Alex and Chris about innovators, how it's shaping the new world, and how it's also, it's almost a responsibility also thinking about how it shapes equity, and actually it shapes the wealth of nations. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts, Natana, as we look at what the role of innovators are. How can we link what innovations are being done with informing policymakers and public leaders?
So I think there's a lot there. I actually am not excited about equity. I think you and I have talked about this privately, but ultimately, there's a question of what kind of abundance do we have, and then there's a question of, well, how is it distributed? But I really love this particular story of the fact that the first ice cream in the Western world was served at the inauguration of King Charles II, and it was only served at the high table, so the king and his closest associates could have some ice cream. No one else could have it. It was very difficult to make. Now, for better or worse, everyone can have lots of ice cream. And so I think that there's ways in which, this is something that we commonly say at Singularity University, the phones that we've got in our pockets are more powerful than the computers that presidents had access to 30 years ago. And so I think we ought to have policies and put in place mechanisms that will lead to the greatest amount of abundance, and that will mean that there will not be equal distributions of it. Then at the same time, we also have to consider, well, how do we steward our planet? But I also think that people sometimes have this misguided understanding that nature is really friendly and we should go back to nature, and that in the state of humans are the problem, and it's really everything's great in nature. And I know that there are really important changes we need to make to safeguard natural environments, but also in the state of nature, you're constantly in a battle for survival, and all of the myriad life that we see comes from that result of the battle for survival. So once we are able to use intelligence to cooperate to create surplus, that is a very unique phenomenon in all of evolved history on the globe. And so we've got to really reflect on how do we start to have a shared set of values and vision that we're going to be working towards, that will inspire us to make the moves that we need to make to protect the planet and people in a positive way. But my concern with equity is kind of the Harrison Bergeron concern that, well, if one person's taller, we can get everyone to be the same height by chopping off the legs of the taller person. And that's actually happening in California right now, in the sense that the Department of Education is talking about getting rid of all advanced mathematics in the name of equity. And that's just such a shame, because it means that we're not going to be able to create amazing new things, because you need to know advanced mathematics to do that. So
yeah. Well, and I think what I really like about what you're saying about that is that, yeah, sometimes we over romanticize a time in which we were somehow living in nature, when in fact you were trying to struggle for a daily survival, and we couldn't even have these conversations about how do we want to live. I mean, the fact that we can even have this conversation right now is a sign that it's a success of civilization that you couldn't have otherwise. And I definitely hear that, like you said, we don't want to make it so that all marigolds are only a certain height, because that would be problematic. And maybe maybe it's more talking about, like how John Rawls talks about, it's equity to opportunity, that everyone has the opportunity, if they are interested or something like that, to be able to move themselves forward. But that it is something you seize on, and we're going to recognize that people have gifts differing and talents differing that they seize upon. But that's a very, I like your story about the ice cream, because it does get to the point that the good news is things are getting democratized, so we can all get them. But that's also the ramification that as things get democratized, some things will be useful and good, some things will be mundane, like cat videos, and then also a small subset of the population may use things for less than good. And so this is the challenge of the space we're in. So I'm now going to segue to Alex and ask the question both on myths as well as things that are invisible. So what, Alex, would you say is the biggest myth out there right now when people talk about the future of data, human rights, and speech? And then I'm going to ask you, after that, I'm going to ask you a rejoinder about what's the biggest thing that people aren't talking about and should be talking about. But first, what's the biggest myth?
Let's see, that's a hard one. I think, so I would say, maybe if I can modify it, maybe like one of the biggest misunderstandings about, in my view about it, is that, and to connect to, I think, Chris's point about non-linearity, which I appreciate and had not heard put quite that way before, is I think we are creating systems of great complexity now, or like we're creating systems more easily than we did before. And these like social media systems or supply chains are all these different things. And I think the notion that indirectly created environments are foreseeable in the same ways that direct actions are foreseeable is, I think, one of the things that is sort of miring like a lot of policy and other discussions right now. But what I mean is, like, if you take action X, then it has whatever decision tree that flows from it. That's one way of looking at it. And part of what I take from Chris's point is that if you have like a greater, potential amplitude of things that might happen and bounce off each other, the things that are theoretically foreseeable, you need to foresee a lot more things potentially. And for me, that goes to the notion that what we ask people to take responsibility for what is foreseeable often in the law. And I think when I think about asking like things like creators of platforms to take responsibility for X, Y, and Z, some of the reason that discussion I think gets stuck is because it goes down to like, what is it reasonable to ask people to foresee when part of what they're doing is creating or contributing to or amplifying nonlinear systems with like greater amplitude or whatever the right word is than you
Yep.
potentially had in the past. And so the limits of what we ask humans to take responsibility for are also sort of curving in unpredictable ways. And I think by relying on old metaphors or analogies or old models of how causation works, I think you wind up sort of stuck and sort of not accommodating how indirect a lot of the modalities that you're working with are. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where we had like a long exchange where it was like, what is social media like? Is it like a book publisher or is it like a thing? And all of us were like, it's not like either.
Right.
It's a new thing. It's not like a horse and it's not like a carriage. Like metaphors will eventually, and like even though the law works through analogical reasoning, like reasoning perfectly from your favorite metaphor is almost certainly going to lead you to the wrong place. And so I think part of what we're grappling with is like correctly describing things in a way that tracks what they actually do. And to me, like one of the like legal concepts that is most bent right now or most misunderstood is like how you can ask creators or innovators or people who are creating systems to take responsibility, like moral responsibility, ethical responsibility, legal responsibility, maybe for the things that they are contributing to setting in motion, but
Right.
also not rely on models of causation or models of foreseeability that come out of systems that I think, if I'm understanding correctly, sort of work at a different potential scale of outcome and just had a different level. And I think that that mismatch in that conversation between, I think, some technologists and some policy folks is, I think, where part of the breakdown is. This is, I throw this idea out every once in a while so I can get shut down, but it's like, I think policy folks should come like sit on a product team for a week and just like come like hang out and just watch something get built so they can like just be part of the process. I know there's like NDA and confidentiality and a million other problems, which is why this will never happen. But I've always felt like if like my trust and safety team had like one or two like people on it for a week that just helped us work through hard problems, then the conversation would be very different just from having like lived through this very difficult problem of like creating some tool or even minor feature and then trying to think about how it's going to move through the world and affect people. And in some ways, like the impossibility of understanding all the things that will happen. And then also the necessity of like figuring out what are the most likely things that will happen, what to do about them.
I think one piece that I find really interesting in relation to what you just said there, Alex, is it's so, depending on the incentives, it's so easy to only look at the negative, and I think we can see that with when we look at what happened. I mean, not that I'm an expert on epidemiology or the FDA, but I think when we look at just, for example, not waiting to do challenge trials here in the U.S., probably there's lots of reasons to have done it, but depending on the incentives and why people are doing what they're doing, it's really easy to take a potential bad outcome that's very unlikely to happen and then totally shift policy based on avoiding any potential bad outcome. And the problem is you get this paralysis and inaction because that's where the incentives lie. And I feel like we end up seeing that as a problem with government action frequently.
Right. I think this is also like um, putting like, if you expand loss aversion to like the population level or the social level, then you're sort of like trying to balance like these like innovation goods versus like either psychological loss aversion or like responsibility for whatever negative outcomes, but in a way that like is not necessarily tracking, because that like fear of loss aversion can be embedded in ways that are that don't track how good some of the positive outcomes are.
Yeah, and this actually speaks to the point that, or the answer that I was going to give for some of the the biggest myth, and I think it's that we overestimate the accuracy of our own data and our own causal beliefs of things, and this leads to like let's take a look at a few of the big nasty black swan events that have happened in the past couple of decades. The Y2K bug. It was a huge deal, but people think, oh, it wasn't a big deal. That's only because the world sunk $100 billion to $500 billion into making it not a big deal. And then the next, look at 9/11. Okay, we had an awful situation. We fixed it a few ways, but we sort of overcorrected some other ways. And I think that pretty much everyone agrees that we overcorrected in many ways to another side effect. And then talking about COVID, we're in a larger information war around this. What sorts of loss functions do we use? And part of it, I think, which makes things a little different as we step forward is something known as Lanchester's laws. So this is something about attrition warfare. So if you've got a bunch of attacks coming from each side, imagine you've got approximately equal warriors. If you've got short spears and you've got twice as many forces, twice as many units, you're twice as strong. So that was going back to the history of warfare. But now, what if you can launch things, you can shoot things and go point to point? Well, now the dynamics are not linear, they're quadratic. You can have all these people shoot at this person and et cetera, and it changes. So that's why today we have rules of engagement of 3 to 1 to make sure that they're unlikely to lose much of your own side, because you're just going to overwhelm with that quadratic superiority. And we've seen empirically that the exponent is somewhere between 1.2 to 1.7 for modern warfare. Step forward to information warfare, it's not quadratic. You don't stop somebody from producing attacks against your information. You flip them. You flip a bot, you flip a person, you convince somebody, to be a skeptic on something or a pro something or an anti something or whatever. And now you start building these warfares or these quote unquote armies of information warfare, which are even more nonlinear.
I think I really appreciate what you just said, Chris, and what you're saying, Alex. And one thing that really fascinates me is the way that our emotional responses tie in and inflect and affect the way that we reason about options. And so the question is, do we get more? Because ultimately, I think the emotional response is what's going to drive us to action. So the question is, do we get more upset about, can we be blamed for something that goes wrong? Or do we get upset about all the potential good things that didn't happen and because we didn't act? And so I think there's just this tremendous bias to inaction the more that you make decisions by committee. That's my personal view. And so I think you end up with just then a really, really hard question of how would you change incentives, particularly around places where you're not using the free market, but you've got a different set of incentives around the way that you're going to create legal strictures or governance functions.
To build on your point, Nathana, there's we as humans underestimate the cost of information acquisition. So if a decision's easy, we make it. We don't talk about it in committee. It's just made. It's Pareto dominated. But once something gets a little bit tricky, now we start bringing a committee. We get this inaction. And sometimes, anybody who's worked in operations research or optimization knows that sometimes you get stuck in these local maxima and you just got to roll a die. You have to have a random decision. And so if you look to the history of decision making, oftentimes there were soothsayers or reading the tea leaves or whatever it happened to be. And if you had an easy decision, you made it. If you didn't, you'd hopefully seek an unbiased random number to unstick you from that. And so these sort of really seemingly arcane decision processes can be more optimal if your random numbers are uncorrelated with reality, assuming your soothsayer doesn't have some political agenda or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, if we don't believe in that randomness or adding that stochasticity or just make a decision sometimes, to not making a decision can be more costly than either of the other outcomes.
Well, I love what you all have. My apologies. We saw a complex adaptive system in motion. In this case, it was the weather deciding to knock out power briefly, which, my UPS kicked in, but of course the internet couldn't keep on working, but I really appreciate that. And then two, that you all jumped in and you demonstrated a complex adaptive system of your own. So I really appreciate that. So Chris is speaking to my heart, because I worshiped at the heart of Herb Simon and Jim March, who did organizational systems and organizational science. And you're absolutely right that oftentimes organizations get trapped in ruts where they cannot get themselves out of thinking what they're already thinking. And so they just perpetuate some incremental change in the status quo. And maybe what, as we set the stage as to why are we talking about the future of data, privacy, and free speech now, it's that the environment that surrounds us has changed so fundamentally, so quickly, that we haven't figured out how to change how we work, whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, or together on these issues. It's like, again, the luggage has shifted in flight, and it wasn't until we opened it up, it's now fallen on our head. It is worth noting on the randomness note that the ancient Greeks did have an idea that democracy could include people that would signal that they want to be in a certain office or have a certain role. They'd then put their names in a pot and they'd shake it up and they'd assign it randomly. The benefit of that is you don't have career politicians. But it is worth the question, though, is how do we go from the system we have right now, which is currently have people that have influence or power either in the private sector or public sector off the old system to the new system? I will tee that up for anyone who wants to jump on that hand grenade. If not, Natana, how would you get us to a better future? How about that? I'll make it that a safer question there.
Well, I think that I think unfortunately there's no easy answer, but I personally think that we have overregulation. So I would be on the side of, hey, let's have lots of regulatory sandboxes. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let's be able to go create things, particularly when it comes to atoms, not bits. So I think if I could kind of wave a magic wand and change things here in the US, I would get rid of NIMBYism with regard to building housing. And I would also get rid of a lot of the different things that protect traditional academic institutions and encourage a lot more competition there. And then I would go to direct payment for healthcare and get rid of insurance companies. And I think that I think that that would have I think those three things would have a huge impact on cost disease of the fact that we're spending so much more on certain goods that we're artificially making scarce.
Oh, and what I love about that you said that is it is about making sure that we have a willingness to experiment, because the only way we're going to figure out this new world in which things are happening in a non-linear space is by experiments. And so
I'd also
maybe
go for only one term for sure, because I think I would want to do really unpopular stuff.
right. Well, and as it is, you think about everything that just changes in one term. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that President Obama was elected at the same time that the original iPhone came out. So this idea of having public services by app has only been something that's come out since he's been president, and who knows what we'll be talking about 4 years from now and 8 years from now when it comes to do you interact with government through a AI chatbot, or do you have a 3-1 service that you can go to any government function? It's a single place. Who knows? But I do think one term, you just think about everything that changes just in 4 years. But the other question I'd ask you real quick, Natana, before I go to maybe Chris and Alex for a similar question, you were talking about how right now we may be rewarding people that are risk averse, because if you do something, given things are emergent, everything like that, even if it's from the goodness of your heart, bad things may happen. How do we begin to have a dialogue that if we don't reward people that are willing to at least take some bold steps forward with a good heart, the way that a republic or democracy dies is by simply inaction as opposed to anything else. And so how do we encourage action in this space?
And Byzantine bureaucracy. I mean, I think that one of the things that's fascinating about startups is that any of them ever work ever. I mean, Alex can also tell you, like, if you've worked at any startup, it's going to have a lot of challenges. And the question is, well, why can't you just solve this problem with money? Because you're always going to have competitors that are better funded than you and have more people they can throw at the problem, and even better educated or smarter people. I mean, you're not the smartest in the room. And so why do startups ever work ever? And I think it's because when you have a small team of people, the incentives are just, you've just totally changed the incentives from a larger organization that has the incentive to preserve itself, regardless of the overall mission. And so I think there has to be some kind of painful, deep renewing of institutions, I think. And the other thing I would say is a real challenge that we have in America today is the fraying of our community organizations and the ways that we come together and have social ties. And I think we need replacements for one of the things I love about Tocqueville is he talks about how unique Americans are with all of the societies that they choose to join and the ways that they take responsibility for engagement and community life. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of pieces of modern life have eroded that. And I think there's some book talking about the crisis of bowling leagues.
Oh yeah, bowling alone, exactly.
Yes,
yeah,
bowling alone. So I think we really need spaces and opportunities for people to engage, and not in ways that I would prescribe, but in ways that would be as decentralized as possible. Because I think a lot of magic comes from what's going to spontaneously arise as people interact, as opposed to trying to plan it from the top.
Well said. Thank you for that. And I agree. especially in a world in which things are emergent, we should also try to be emergent ourselves. And so that leads now to Chris. And so I'm going to ask you a first question, Chris, which is, again, same question as Natana. How do we reward and encourage people to take action versus become so risk averse that they don't do anything? What would you recommend in that space?
Yeah, so that, I think it's alignment of incentives and understanding what we call in nonlinear dynamics, the fixed points, the attracting fixed points of the system. So for example, like Nathana was mentioning, oftentimes there are positions of power where companies, when they get big enough, they keep on attracting them, and their goal is just to survive at that point and sort of drop some of their original missions. And from some of my colleagues that I've worked with in economics, there's sort of a growing notion. There's not a lot of publications around this yet, that there's some amount of competition that is optimum, and there's sort of a notion around 6 firms where they all try to whittle it down to 2, and when they get there, they sort of get stuck in this oligopoly, keep on growing power, and sort of try to fend off and destroy all the little ones coming up. We see similar things in evolution as well. So I think it's making sure that there is, going back to that stochasticity and incentive alignment, such that if you get too big and you're now just defending power, let's change the incentives a little bit, but let's change the incentives to make sure there's more bubbling up and growing competition to make sure that things are competitive. And we keep searching the landscape to find what's good.
Excellent. And I like that, again, going back to evolutionary biology, it shows that if we don't keep on searching the landscape, we will become extinct. The recipe for extinction is when you fail to keep up with the pace of change in the environment around you. And so that leads to another question, if you're open to it, Chris, before I go to Alex. We got a question from Stephen in the audience who said, how do we rectify the desire for less regulation on things in the public sphere with the elimination of NIMBYism, or the loss of total control? So how do we still have some semblance of control while also not having too much regulation? How do we balance those two?
Yeah, I think some of it goes back to that competition and making sure there's different things that you can select yourself to. There's these cyberpunk dystopias where you have to align yourself with one of 6 companies, and that's like your artificial nation state. And that sounds like a lot of dystopian things. But if there is, an ability to sort of restart and rewind a little bit and grow anew, I think that's what we want to encourage. And so going back to the regulatory landscape, you look at the Byzantine laws in some places, and they just keep on growing. That's sort of the nature. One of my favorite games that I never want to play is a game called Gnomic. The game is this: you roll a die. That's the number of points you get. You go around in a circle, and the first person who collects 100 points wins. Very much like Candyland. Not an interesting game, except there's a second thing that you can do. Every time that you make after you finish your turn, you can propose an amendment to the rules. And if it is approved by 2/3 majority, that amendment sticks. And the game is intentionally boring to drive it to a game about rules. If you look at how this game is played over email for 15 years, you end up with these arcane Byzantine laws where they're literally defining what is causality, for their domain, and it reads like legislation. And this is an attracting fixed point of these sort of dynamic systems. So I think that we need some sort of pressure to, as we would call machine learning, to regularize it, to simplify it and not overfit. Whether it's some sort of stochastic sunsetting of laws or stochastic sunsetting of politicians or whatever it happens to be, some sort of regularizer to keep that complication in check.
Love it. And I do like the idea that you've now begun to think about stochastic sunsetting of laws would force us to reevaluate whether or not the laws are still useful. And I can remember once I did an interesting project where it was just a small executive order back in 2009, where it was what people didn't realize back in 2009, if there was ever a day in which there was a really bad day for the country and the president wanted to nationalize part or all of our telecommunications grid, at the time in 2009, that was done through the science advisor. And so people would become a science advisor and they would have no idea this was their responsibility. We tried to map out just the actions that were associated with just a very short executive order. It ended up being a 5-foot by 5-foot poster. And that was just one executive order. So this does point to the interesting idea that if we had random sunsetting, then at least we'd reevaluate, do we need something like this? Do we need to update it? And that would lead to, it's almost like how, if you don't allow the forest fire to happen every once in a while, things get really bad when the really big forest fire happens. And so maybe we need some controlled burns.
And one quick thing to add to that, the stochastic sunsetting could be based on how popular the law was. If something is so clear that it has 99% of people voting for it, well, okay, maybe that doesn't ever get sunset. But if it was 51%,
yeah,
maybe we should look at it in 4 years. Yeah.
Excellent. I like that a lot. Well, thank you, Chris, for that. And so, Alex, I'll go to you and ask, again, the question, first the question, and another question we got from the audience, but the first question is, what would you do to encourage people to be more brave and being willing with good intent to move forward, as opposed to becoming risk averse when it comes to whether it's private sector or public sector initiatives in this space?
Yeah, so it's funny. I've worked at startups where sometimes it feels like we've drawn our job descriptions out of a hat, actually,
There you
uh,
go.
and maybe that's why startups work. And I think there is like an optimal level of like order Muppet to chaos Muppet at startups that allows this to work. Where you need at least one person who like comes in once a week and just like upends everything. And so, you know, and if you don't know who it is, it's probably you.
That's a good one. I was thinking about it. Oh, and I was like, okay, that's me.
So the thing that I would like to focus on, and I think a lot of what I think about, in some ways, I think a lot of what I do is try to tell accurate stories about what is reality now, and how to evolve narratives to keep up with the challenges. And so there was a Adam Gopnik had an old thing in the New Yorker that was like, oh, in the US, we have this great thing called fact checkers, which is like when you're a journalist, you have somebody who goes and calls and they verify that, people agree with the fact, whatever the factuality of what it is you're saying happened. And then he sort of proposed that like in France, they should have like a theory checker, which is like, you don't have to have the facts right, but somebody will read your article and decide whether your theory is consistent. um, and so for me, what I think about a lot now is that as somebody who sort of like uses language and tries to tell stories, and to me, policies and laws are essentially stories about what you think may happen. The challenge is that you get off track with data, right? And I think we're at a moment where we want to wed the insights and the utility of data with acceptance of the ways that the human brain works, including our emotional responses to things, in a way that's not in tension with each other. So as Chris like alluded to earlier, you can have, X bad event happen and react or misreact in a bunch of different ways because of, the way that we work. And so if they didn't have to be in tension with each other, I would sort of like a data checker. To me, I'm interested in telling emotionally accurate stories about our best conclusions that the data show,
Hmm.
right? And I think that is a very hard thing to do because the old stories feel familiar and feel right, and have like a sort of like just have a symmetry and have a level. Sometimes you're in a rut, or sometimes they just work in ways that are attractive to our history of storytelling. But I think keeping up with innovation, keeping up with what our aspirations are, also involves sort of, I think, wedding this sort of like the rationality of doing good data analysis with the acceptance that emotional reactions to things are not a limitation. They're our lived reality. And so finding ways to represent data in ways that cause people to have like the emotionally, I don't say appropriate reaction, because they can have whatever reaction they want, but doing it in a way that is not manipulative or not skewed or not intended to be in tension with data. And I think this is really hard and something that journalists are like getting better and better at. And so I have a lot of hopes around like figuring out incentives for getting that part of our information supply chain to work really well, for policymakers, for citizens, for everybody, so that we can have more of a shared conversation. And I guess the last thing, like part of my lessons from living in the Bay Area, like Natana's, is that um, you probably also need to keep expanding the circle to think about who your stakeholders are.
Mm.
I feel like this is like, I feel like Peter Singer and others, they're like the circle generally expands, right? Like you realize that there's more sentient things out there. And so in the Bay Area, it's sort of like buyers versus renters or whatever. But you can imagine a lot of places where whenever we're drawing the line about who we consider to be a valid stakeholder and how we weight their opinions, I think that is also a recalibration that like could also happen, through stochasticity, through sunsetting, through chaos muppetry, but in some sort of like planned fashion.
I love it. I mean, and I mean, it was very elegant how you said, Alex, that really what we're facing is a world in which we're trying to bring data in, but we're recognizing that it may not mesh with our old stories. And so we shouldn't be surprised if there is either emotional outburst or false nostalgia. It relates to something, it was more of a comment, but it was also sort of a question from Mark Moffat in our audience that said, nations and networks don't actually distribute accurate information. They instead do ideas that can be sold. And then of course, science makes people uncomfortable. So I'll ask one last question by analogy, and then we'll go to the lightning round. So I believe it was back in the 1980s and then later in the 90s, they actually did this experiment where they did the bargaining game, where the computer was programmed to make offers to human participants. And if the human offers participants accepted, let's say it makes you some offer out of $100, it offers you 40 out of the $100. If you accept, you get $40, the machine keeps 60. And of course, economics would say you should accept anything the machine offers you, even a penny, because a penny is better than nothing. But we know humans will reject some offers that aren't fair. And what they told him is that the computer had already been programmed. It wasn't making this up on the fly. It wasn't random. And in fact, they were going to give him an envelope after the experiment so you could see how the computer played. And even then, even though they were told the computer was hard programmed and it was actually already going to do its responses, there were times when the experimenters turned down offers from the computer. And that's not logical at all. But so I guess the question is, are we as humans, through what evolutionary selection pressures have shaped our brains for, and that we want this sense of fairness and we want bargaining, which is not a bad thing, at odds with the foreignness of the machines that we have created? So Alex, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how do we reconcile analytic machines and emotional human beings?
Yeah, that one is very interesting. This I think a related example I have is like when you do negotiation workshops where you're like role playing and take a fake position, people still wind up like getting really heated and practically getting into fistfights sometimes over fighting over like non-existent disputes
Yep.
that they're doing in character. And so I think that suggests a similar set of forces at work. I think to me the rub there is partly around like which things you're accepting as part of how humans work and which things are sort of rewirable or can be refactored through whatever you want to do, mindfulness or better incentives or shifting norms or whatever. I think the sort of crude answer is like you sort of have to do both. Like I think I'm a fan of looking at things that people would call human limitations as being like human gifts or just like or that they're positive affirmative things that so I don't view them as like vestigial and problematic, but I think you sort of like I think for folks who care about innovation and who would like to reshuffle rules frequently to sort of see what happens, I think you try to push to the limit how plastic and how porous some of these things can be, and then sometimes you're wrong and then you pull back. But I think that puts us in a much better place than observing human behavior and assuming that it is somehow hardwired. I would and this might just be my own fictional like disposition, which is like I'd prefer to think more things are plastic and be wrong than prefer more things are evolutionary fixed and then have them confirmed without having experimented with it. And I know other people's preferences are going to be different on that one, so we'd have to like figure out how to allocate those things, and maybe some parts of the country like it more than others. But I think as a nation, these are sort of things to expressly address without, I think, falling into like a tribalism over it, which is proven like a lot harder than it sounds.
Right. Well, and I love what you said that I agree. I sat on, I hope things are more plastic. I mean, if you look at even at just the very short history of our own nation, I mean, we've had a lot of change. And so if we continue to embrace the ability to continue to change, then we're in a good place. If we sort of lock down and say, no, we've always been this way, then bad things might start to happen. So now we're at the lightning round. And this is where we sort of begin to wrap things up. And we go now to like, if we began with the big why, 30,000 foot level, and then we talked a lot about the what and the 15,000 foot level. We're now in the final descent to land the plane as to how we can do things. I'm going to go first to Chris, then to Alex and then Tana, and this is for 2 to 3. You can do a little bit more if you want, but tweet length recommendations as to how we move forward from this. It can be to any audience that you want, public, private, whatever you see. But Chris, first, what would be 2 to 3 tweet length how recommendations you would have as to how we move forward from this?
Yeah, I think that industry especially, but also governments and other organizations should provide the tools to share the knowledge, but also provide the controls to share the knowledge that wants to be shared. So for example, you want to maintain people's ability to maintain autonomy and privacy. So how can I share the insights without sharing that original data? But then also, how can you check to make sure that I shared correct data and the correct insights? So I think we need to provide both the tools for that information dissemination, the tools to create information, but also the the ways to introspect and learn what why was this decision made, and trace it all the way back to provenance. And I think it is an arms race, but I think that the more transparency we have in the decision making processes themselves, the better.
Oh, I love that. And this gets back to our narrative conversation that in some respects you're using the technology as a proxy. And yes, we want explainability with our data and our AI, but we also want explainability from our boards and our juries. And so this could actually be a way to actually get that. And so I really like that as an action step forward. So thank you, Chris, for that. Alex, your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations.
Yeah. So I guess I would go back to one of the things I said earlier, which is sort of see what happens if you expand the circle, and include more people or more beings as stakeholders. It might lead you to have a slower process or more process and can make decision making harder. But I think I think that's sort of implicit in Chris's point about, I think, or distributing things, which is see how many things you could incorporate into the system and accommodate for, as part of your narrative. I think the other thing I would say is include whatever disciplines are left out. So I think, I think in the technologies we need more, we need more sociology, we need more humanism, we need more philosophy. I think in policy discussions we need more technology, we need more math, we need more statistics. And so I think if you look for the counterpoint and blind spot, you'll often get a very helpful supplement for where you need to go.
Very well said, and I like exactly what as you said. We need to be expanding the circle both in terms of people participation, but also domain participation, because this will expand the search space as we try to adapt to the changing world. So I really appreciate that. Those are great remarks too, Alex. And Natana, you get to bring it home for us. What's your recommendations in this space?
I'd love to see more transparency and more trust for people. So what I mean by that is I think, I know it's possible to do FOIA requests for the federal government, but I would love to see just the entire San Francisco city budget line by line, where everything goes, and understand who's being influenced how. Um, and I think also, um, really supporting people to thrive and having a conversation around what thriving looks like. And I think we've evolved in it. We started the conversation. I mentioned we evolved in the state of survival, so it's very easy to get into this survival state. I think that associations and community and simple pleasures in life, going for a walk in the park, those are things that push people to being able to be in a thriving mode. And I think when folks are in a mode of having the potential to thrive, then we're all going to make better decisions.
I love
So
it.
I think just shifting the conversation that way.
Well, thank you, Natana. And I really like your recommendation of both transparency, but transparency not just to one group, but to all groups, and thriving. I think those are both um, things that can help us move forward, especially in this decade ahead. I want to thank each of you for your wonderful remarks, Alex, Chris, and Natana. Also to our audience, stay tuned. May 26th is, as Natana, there was no sponsorship or anything like that. She put me in the spot when she mentioned the GeoTech Commission report, but we are releasing a major report after more than 13 months. It's actually bipartisanly supported. It's a report on the commission on the geopolitical impacts of new technologies on data. We'll have senators, we'll have representatives, and in an era in which bipartisanship is hard to come by, we'll actually achieve it. But also industry, because if anything, we recognize that really it's going to be entrepreneurs that shape the world in the next decade ahead. And with that, I want to thank everyone and remind you, as we say at the GeoTech Center, please be bold, please be brave and benevolent for the future ahead. See you next time.